let me just rewind for a second and go back to like starting an office. So I went to graduate school. I worked in a firm for a while. I was a principal in a firm, and then I decided to start a practice, and that was like in 2009. And in 2009, there just wasn't a lot going on. The economy had crashed, and so it was a good time and a bad time. It's a good thing in that you don't have too much to do, so you can kind of get organized and think rather than just hustling around and trying to make a buck. The bad thing is that there's not like real projects to practice on and earn enough to build a firm. And so that's the economic context. And then I live here, and California is great big state, but the Bay Area has this over concentration of landscape architects, probably more than any other metropolitan area in the country, perhaps the world, and I mean that. There's good reasons for that, but it makes it super competitive. So I had this moment in 2000, maybe 10. I was teaching at Berkeley. I showed up for a meeting about an RFP meeting for a new park. It was a little 1 acre thing, and there was about 50 landscape architects. There was barely enough room for us in the park. And I looked around and I was like, this is not going to work. You're competing with all the. How do you tell these guys apart? How do you know what they do? And so that was a moment. And then California in general is, I think, it's a great place to practice because it's just the extreme of everything. And it has this kind of doubling effect, and it just gets more and more complicated every day. And you see that. You just watch the news and you see that, and you watch the news and then think about how that affects spatial planning and design and just challenges of environment. And it really is everywhere, and that's why I say we need really good people and more and better schools. And so it's at that moment that I started to think about, what's the formulation of a firm that's going to have meaning and be effective and attract the challenges and do work that's sort of advancing and making progress in really difficult conditions and doing interesting things. And so that's where Bionic came from. It's this kind of, the idea is that it's just has this immediate connotation of something that's alive and something made, and that's, we engage in just the combination of that every day. It's not about like my name, it's about kind of a group or an approach to practice, and there's a certain assertiveness about it that we believe in optimism, in invention, in acting across our boundaries, and that's the kind of firm, that was the hypothesis. And then with just a really simple mandate of enabling life, and so that was the test. That was our mandate. The mandate at the time, me, office of one, like literally, you start an office with like a laptop and a cell phone and a desk, and then you go from there. So that's what I was doing. And at the time, then I did a bunch of projects that were really just tests. So this was the first thing that I did for a small art museum, and it was located off the street, and they had just a visibility problem. And so we designed this kind of glowing terrain and that kind of came down off the roof and went over the garden. And this is made of stuff that landscape architects don't use at all. It's a 400-watt solar array, phosphorus-coated wire, a couple hundred fiberglass rods. It's hooked up to that solar panel. It comes down the facade, and that charge makes the wires glow. And this was the first project we did. It was kind of like a visibility project, and it was a kind of an unusual sort of sign for this unusual urban space. This is a competition in Four Point Channel in Boston, kind of an industrial channel where you can't. There's not really nothing to see, and so this was an idea about kind of making something so you could look up at the sky. So it's a combination of a fuel bladder and a log and a burner. It's basically a big water bed that was heated by the fire, and you look up at the sky and planes landing in Boston's airport. And so this was another, I did a bunch of competitions. This is an exhibition in East Lansing, Michigan for, they got a dead downtown. So this was taking all this kind of void space in parking garages and doing a hops farm, making a hops farm around the outside of it, and then just occupying the top as a park, and because it's flat there and there's no view anywhere. So this is about reusing old infrastructure and kind of assigning new programs to it. This is a competition in Chicago. That right there was supposed to be a mile-high skyscraper by this Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava. The financial crash came, and they built this, $30 million foundation, and they didn't have a project to go on top of it. Super prominent site. So this is about the transitional use of that, and it was a giant steam ring launcher, and you'd take water out of Lake Michigan, and it would use that big cavity to launch steam rings and make a spectacle out of it and assign a new purpose to the site. So again, a different kind of, an adaptation or invention from infrastructure. And this is a competition for San Francisco Bay and about using sediment to adapt to sea level rise. And it's just a very complicated issue. And so we were thinking about designing an infrastructure that did more than one thing. And so it was a pipeline to move sediment, and it had a whole array of different kinds of apparatuses and purposes on pontoons. There were a network of islands that were connected to this pipeline, and you would use it for all these functions, really to make the bay, this gigantic regional landscape adapt over time. And this is more like making a utility out of for moving mud, but it would have these other functions like disaster response, and it would do the big difficult projects. What's cool about this is, we're speculating on this is 8-9 years ago, and today we're in an international competition to do this, and we're thinking about it. And so these things take time, I guess, is one thing, but they have a way of growing in the process. So that's kind of how I started a firm, and it was a good kind of intellectual foundation. It wasn't confused by clients or by financial motivations. It was about testing the thesis or the hypothesis of a firm. Another thing that we've just done along the way is what I would say is it's difficult to do something different than what always gets done, right? It's really safe to look and say that's how that was done, and so I don't want to risk anything. Let's just do it again that way. Maybe we'll change the color. And we're asking the question. I mean, we're seeing the world in a different way and saying that's wrong, that's broken, that needs to be better, it needs to be bigger, and we have to persuade people to see it and think differently. And so just as a firm, we've developed a whole set of data methods, and I won't go into it, but it has a lot to do with kind of measuring and seeing things and making an empirical case and then converting that to design opportunity. So, and these veer into all sorts of different territory that isn't typical for landscape architects. So here's economic strategies. This is about gathering materials and harvesting materials from other infrastructure projects, and so that you could, build a big public park in this particular case. We have a whole kind of arsenal of information and branding and identity efforts that we've done. We conduct research. This is for environmental centers all on the West Coast, and looking at their data and their economics and pulling their tax returns to make a case for what economic, or for what eco centers should be. This is about going out and measuring and surveying and talking to people in order to kind of define the form of a wall. And this is work that we've done at Fort Mason Center for developing like a program for this arts and culture complex. It's not too far away from here. And so we have a whole set of data methods, and this is time-lapse tracking of pedestrian behavior. And we use this as building a base case or building a case or building a logic for a design departure. And it's just an important tool or a set of tools, or really maybe even just a way of thinking about what we're seeing to be more persuasive. So, so there's a hypothesis, a start, some methods, and fast forward to 8 years later, and this is where the range of our work right now. So that's the size of a sticker to the size of a region. That's San Francisco Bay on the right, and we're building things. This will just go kind of small to large. This is a project about doing temporary bike lanes. Bike lanes are ugly and they take a long time. And so this was a kind of industrial design project about just thinking about how you could make and pilot and test bike lanes and make it go faster. So we started with just this idea of like a sticker. You could kind of get a bike lane in the mail and install it yourself. And then it goes up to these modules and really small, simple things that array to much larger scale. And then these are kind of a kit approach. And they have a kind of identity to them and an iconography to them that people will recognize as not just like roadside hardware, but really as a system. And then they have these adaptations, make them more useful, and the whole thing is about trying to generate bike advocacy and get other modes of transportation and stop designing just around cars. And then all of it packs flat and it's very efficient and basically doesn't need specialized labor. That small museum that I talked about, the first commission, well, they moved to a different place, and they moved to Dog Patch, a post-industrial neighborhood where the blocks are 600 feet long, and they're trying to get visibility, and so they talked to us about, so here they are right there. So they're right in the middle of a 600-foot long block, and then there's a train that zips by, and they're trying to get people to like come back, so the trains and cars zoom by, the train station's down here. So the object is get people to come back here and check out the museum. So we designed a public space. I don't even like to call it a parklet. This is 3 parking spaces, about $160,000 in 3 parking spaces. And it's designed to have 2 personalities. So the one side of it has this faceted wall, and it's got and it changes colors, and it's meant to kind of engage the kinetic energy of these machines zipping by on the street. So from one side it's white, then the other side flips and turns green, and that's what you see from the vehicular experience. From the pedestrian side, it's a tricked out big piece of urban furniture. So it's got planting and adjustable stools and ADA spaces for wheelchair. It's got a foot rail. It's got an armrest and a place for your $6 latte, and then it's got this kind of symbols, even sort of encoded in it, like that chevron. You're not supposed to advertise on parklets, but that chevron is kind of pointing you to the gift shop that's right there, so you can see it from like 200 feet down the street. It's got lighting, and so it's making a public space in a very narrow sliver, and it's of a big urban system, and it's been out there a couple of years. It works really well, and it's at night there's it lights up. It's got nano coatings to help with graffiti. This is in Mountain View, downtown Mountain View. It's right next to a train station, and this is a 16,000 square foot living roof. And so the setup for this is that like this was built in a time when nobody's building really anything, and this developer needed to do everything, and on from a lot line to lot line construction. So the roof is an amenity space. It treats stormwater. It has a whole kind of composition of plants that's it has seasonal dynamics. It catches the wind. It's very animated, and it contributes to kind of a mosaic of urban habitats. And so it's I think this project moved incredibly fast. It was done during kind of the recession times. One of the first projects that we built, and it just adds a tremendous amount of value to this place. And I think one of the coolest things about it is that you can see the Zeppelin hangar at Moffett Airfield, which is one of my favorite buildings right there. One of the other things that we've done as an office is like, we couldn't find the projects we wanted to work on, we try to make the projects we wanted to work on and then try to make them real. And so this is one of these. This is the 101 going through San Francisco, major entry to the city. And a community group called us and said that they wanted to do something about it. The real setup here is that it's designed for this. Now it conducts this, and it's even more than that. And it's just an overloaded corridor. And there was this promise of it being like the landscaped parkways of the East Coast, and just through deferred maintenance, it's turned into this, and it catches on fire. That's kind of like a cave. There was a guy living in there, and that's carved out of serpentine rock. I took this photo. It's a really dangerous and kind of situation, very close to the city, at the entry of the city, and it has these things about it that are kind of fascinating and scary at the same time. So we started this project like at a concerned neighbor's dining room table, and she made us cookies, and we talked about it. We helped them design a project, and the basic idea was here that like there's all these little kind of patches, and to link all those up and make a place out of it, and really kind of exploit some of the qualities of this piece of urban infrastructure we all kind of hate. This is something that we all hate and need at the same time. And so it's a very kind of three-dimensional place, and got all these different conditions above, under, over, around a freeway. We generated renderings, and we helped them for years, and we got, maybe a year ago, we got to a point where we helped them raise a couple $1 million, and now we're going into designing the first phase of it. So you start small, and you start with ideas, and it's kind of through our own ambition and putting ideas out there and visualizing them, helping people to understand them, that motivate people and create funding and make things happen. And if you were to put that project out on the street in San Francisco and say, here's a project under a freeway and it's funded, you'd get all 50 of those landscape architects that I saw in that park 5 years before. Yeah, them and more would show up, but through kind of initiative, and I would say just developing a project a different way, we've been able to create some opportunities for ourselves. We have a urban design portfolio as well. This is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We won this in a competition. This is a new entry into their downtown. So Pittsburgh's a cool place. It's got a really interesting industrial past, but it's a Rust Belt city, and and it was divested, and there's a lot of neglected maintenance. And so this is a project about reoccupying a part of a city that's sort of dominated by cars and benign neglect. So this is a 21st century street, kind of street wall to street wall redesign, new water systems, bike lanes, a sculpture walk. It's designed for events. It's got sort of a greater degree of comfort and furnishings, and so that it's used in more times of the year. And this kind of work of redesigning the space that designed around vehicles is we see it more and more. It's actually a really good expertise to develop and think creatively about. For about 10 years now, I've been working in Malibu, California, to design the coastal access system, and this is a really unusual context. Most people, when they think of Malibu, have this kind of like dreamy idea of it. It's about like celebrities and fame and this kind of life that's just out of reach and is dangled in front of all of us. And I see it in a really different way, because behind all of this, there's this kind of excess and a kind of greediness. And it's not about financial greed, it's about the greediness of a resource, the Pacific Ocean. So this is Barbra Streisand's house. She's got like 9 chimneys. Her deck there is like an acre. The erosion in Malibu is pretty extreme because people have built right up to the water. They have these kind of rent-a-cops that ride around. They have no authority. They just chase people off the beaches. Most of Malibu is on septic, which means that you know what goes you know where, and the water actually isn't as clean as it shows in all the images that we see about Malibu. These are all signs that you can go buy at the hardware store, and there's a clear message that's like, get out, we own this, we don't want you here. And this is most people's experience of the Pacific Ocean if you're from the public. What the law says is that the wet sand is public and the dry sand is private, and that line shifts back and forth depending on the time of the day. And that line is actually getting higher and higher also. So it's a very dynamic place. And this is a project about, this, I call this the Great Wall of Malibu. It's this line of homes, most of which not that great, by the way. Just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean you have good taste. And they really form a wall. And this is a project about the access system and breaking that wall down. So we're doing 8 of these projects. I'll just show you a couple of them. You can't make this stuff up. Truth really is stranger than fiction here. So this project is this is 5 feet wide. It's about 60 feet long. It's about 15 feet deep. It sits right between these 2 houses, and this guy put his hot tub equipment and his stair there, and it's a public access easement. They've been in lawsuit for 9 years, I think. He's now into a period where he's getting fined. He was getting fined on a daily basis. $4,000 a day is the fine for litigation for people in Malibu is just kind of like part of the cost of owning a home. So we've been designing this access point so that you can actually find this little sliver. And so it's kind of designed, it's polished stainless steel for a marine environment. It sticks out just enough. It's really different from what's around it. And it kind of has this kind of kaleidoscope encounter with the ocean. And all this is for is just visual access to get out to the end. This is a little further down on the beach. That's about $1.5 million of land, and a guy bought it in basically as a reparation for putting his tennis court on another easement. So there's just extreme audacity. Our clients call this the Millionaires versus Billionaires project, because what happens is that the millionaires live up here on the hill, and the billionaires live there, and they don't want people to come to the beach. So this will be like beach access for several miles, and it's designed to be a seawall replacement, or a seawall, and it's protecting really important infrastructure that runs under the freeway It's got a pretty complex section designed into it, or things like this. That's a wave return. And the whole thing just has a very big kind of sculptural quality to it. It's in a really dynamic setting where, in a storm, 6-7 feet of material can be deposited, right? So a storm can go by, and then the bottom stair could be over here. So really extreme conditions. So there's several more of those, and they're all really different and have totally weird stories. We have an infrastructure portfolio. This is for a competition that we won in Palo Alto, a new bridge that goes over the 101 freeway. It launches, kind of in this urban, very kind of compact urban situation of Palo Alto, over 13 lanes, lands in the Baylands, a wetland, and so you come off the bridge, and this is bike and ped, and so the bikes and peds split. And then there's also a way to get down to the kind of lower level. And the whole idea with this was just to scrape away the fill that was placed over the top of the baylands and reveal the bay mud underneath, which has kind of all the diatoms and can host the benthic organisms that birds will feed on. And so just kind of activating the ecological properties of bay mud was the really kind of simple but probably most impactful move. And then the bridge in the wetland had a whole, below it had a whole kind of sea level rise adaptation strategy for it. So again, like, started something and an ideas in a competition and learned something about mud and sediment, and several years later it shows up in a competition about a bridge in the Baylands. This is a different kind of infrastructure project. This is a solar project, and this is about putting a solar array in a freeway corridor. The technology is called a CPV, concentrated photovoltaic, and basically it has sun tracking technology in it, so it takes a smaller footprint than like your basic fixed panel array. I knew something about solar because I did the first project I did was a little 400-watt array connected to some phosphorus wires, and then you know enough to learn more and do something bigger and better. The interesting thing about this technology is it has a lot to it actually works oddly well with the habitat needs of California quail. They don't want people around them. They want to be kind of separated and fenced off. They need access for infrastructure or to maintain them. And so this was kind of a photovoltaic array and a California quail habitat, and kind of an odd combination, but it works really well. And then this is a linear version, which is on a cut slope, and this had a whole kind of public information piece to it about solar energy being generated locally, not from someplace far, far away. We've in the past couple of years been building more, and this was a project that we started for Google. And then right in the middle of that, Google sold the whole thing to LinkedIn. And then right after that, LinkedIn got bought by Microsoft for $30 billion. Crazy set of events. But to design a project that goes from one client to another client to another owner makes for a really fast-paced work environment. And you're trying to do something and accomplish things in a project, and at the same time, you've got to manage the realities of it. So this is about making a very typical office condition do something more than just office. So it's got this kind of paving pattern, which is a very subtle cue about how to get from one door to another. But then it's got rather than having like plants from New Zealand and some plants from China and some plants from the Mediterranean, these are all California natives. It's very seasonal, and it provides it's a patch in a landscape of mosaic landscape for pollinators and birds. It treats stormwater, and this is the thing that I'm most proud of. That right there, that kind of scruffy thing with the flowers poking out of it, that's a fire lane. So fire lane, really mundane, but pretty much every project has one. They want to be rock hard, 8 inches of pavement, no fixed objects in them, and we're trying to challenge that notion and break that down and make it do something the rest of the time, and put things into the scale of people instead of the scale of fire trucks, and harder than it sounds. I'm proud of it though, and actually, people appreciate that. This is a different kind of project. Working again, this started for Google, and then it became LinkedIn's campus, and this is repositioning an office park, and so it was a parking lot. It's acres and acres and acres of paving. It's in a vast wasteland of not very interesting buildings, and so it's not doing much. The project that we put back there did a couple things. It maintained like all of these really mature trees, which provided a lot of kind of basic things like shade and to the buildings and to the public realm. And then there's a landscape below that sits very low. It's a big meadow. It treats stormwater. It's beautiful. It changes through the seasons. And then kind of floating above that is about 2 acres of deck. And what the deck is doing is, this was conceived in kind of like the 80s, before the Americans with Disabilities Act was really fully in effect and being practiced. So all these things are at different elevations. It's kind of an old, mean way of doing things. And this connects all the dots up and makes it accessible to everybody. And so it's got a dynamic, very seasonal landscape specific to the Santa Clara Valley, and that's what most people see. The really interesting part of that is that what makes that the landscape work there is air conditioners. So we're in meetings with architects all the time, and they spend an unbelievable amount of time talking about stuff that you just don't care about. But if you listen closely, it's not interesting. You chose the right field. Like, being an architect's kind of boring. It really is. Anyway, they talk about air conditioners a lot, and so and I'm interested in air conditioners. Actually, I did a competition about air conditioners, and I knew a little something about them. And then, so they spent $10 million doing the structural upgrades for the air handling units in all these buildings, because the tech world is crazy about air quality, because the buildings are just horrible places to be in. They don't have operable windows and so on. Anyway, $10 million on air conditioners, structural upgrades, and they produce a condensate stream. And the condensate stream is different than, it's kind of the inverse of our hydrograph in California. We have wet winters and dry summers, and air conditioners have dry winters and wet summers. And so all of these air conditioners probably produce about 5,000 gallons a day in the summer, and they go down to these basins, which are precast concrete troughs that you might commonly see for watering cattle, so all the condensate goes into those, and then and then we irrigate from those basins in the meadow. And so all of this is really living and kind of got this very kind of dependent relationship with air conditioners. I love that. I'm just going to flip through this stuff. It's got a lot of cool details. It looks great at night. But the air conditioners are really the most interesting thing about it, I think. The other thing I would say about it is most campuses try to put a wall around it. This is open, and so this is like a Silicon Valley mega block, but if you're a pedestrian, you can kind of take a shortcut, walk through here, and you're walking through something really unexpected. There's a whole information kind of educational part of it too. Rewind again back to when there's nothing going on. The art museum that I helped out with this little installation, well, they also helped curate an art fair at Fort Mason Center, and they needed a sculpture garden. So we helped them make a sculpture garden. This is in the festival pavilion. We helped them make a sculpture garden, and the challenge with it was that trucks needed to go in and out of this thing and load the art in and out, and so we needed to design a sculpture garden that could work with the operations of the building. And then we didn't know what any of the art was, so we found this hanger right there, and it used to be used for hanging communications cables from ships, and they would hang it on the building. And we used it to hang this big array of rope, and so we made this out of like 3,000 feet of rope and 3,000 stickers. So the stickers make a kind of paving pattern, and the rope is tensioned and makes this kind of unusual frame to guide you to the door. And it went up in it kind of took 3 months to design. It was installed in 3 days. It was up for 3 days, and it took about 3 hours to uninstall. So it was very kind of purpose built, not so much for like what it looked like, but kind of what it had to do, and for a cultural event. And it was really fun. I like to make things, so I was kind of interested in doing installation work because I just like to see things materialize rather than looking at them on paper. Fast forward 5 years later, did this little installation over in the corner, Fort Mason Center, which is an arts and culture complex on the center of San Francisco waterfront. So we're here, right? Something like that. And there's a competition, and we teamed with this Dutch firm called West 8, and we won the competition. And it's a competition about turning a parking lot into a public realm. It's got an arts and culture complex. The Art Institute actually just went in that middle building. And but you can't really, it's designed to keep people out, not welcome people in. So this is a very constricting context. National Historic District in a national park. For 6 years, I've been working on this. We're going into design development now, and I've spent the past 5 months arguing about a curb. I'm not joking. It takes fortitude, but what we're trying to do is simple things like make these buildings more human, bring people back into this space, really highlight the track system. All of Fort Mason Center is basically like a big machine for bringing materials into load onto ships. This is how are we doing on time? You all right?
So what do I do? About 10 minutes until we should wrap up.
Okay. I'll do this quickly. This is where I came from. In Sunnyvale, we're doing an urban design, 6 square blocks. See these trees right here? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4. It's surrounded by a shopping mall, Macy's, right there. This was about 10 years ago. Retail's failing right now, and enormous tracts of land used for consumption and cars are shifting and changing. And so this Sunnyvale has a donut hole. They got a big city, right, with nothing in the middle now. So we're working with a whole team of architects and developers to redesign this and to make a public realm. But to make it someplace where it has real vitality to it, you have to start with the basics. So we've just been talking to a whole group of people that have really different backgrounds into making like a full neighborhood, and what does that mean to make a complete neighborhood. A big part of it was just like thinking through the scenarios of like what people would do every day and what makes good, what makes experiences versus just buying stuff. And then we've been leading the design of all the public realm, making this new linear park. And then it turns a corner and it comes around, and those 4 trees that were in the middle of that shopping mall are now kind of the centerpiece of this big kind of public landscape. And it's meant to be this kind of unusual object that you interact with, and it could be for adults and it could be for kids to play on, and it's very open to interpretation, and kind of like an even huge piece of furniture. I want to go through this quickly. One of the things I did early in my career was I worked for a nonprofit in the Sierra Club to help them kind of address some urban design issues out here at Hunters Point Shipyard. In the process of doing that, I kind of made the biggest. I sort of poked the biggest developer in town, and sort of challenged the notion of the development they were doing. And it was with drawings like this and talking about how much it takes in bus fare to get from one side of the city to the other. And it was a big elaborate logic about building a landscape, a big landscape like the ones the rest of the city enjoy in Bayview. And it was interesting work and kind of larger scale, and it didn't make me a lot of friends. But I thought we were saying and doing the right thing. Several years later, I just learned a lot about that part of the city by studying it and doing a project there. Many years later, I'd been looking at this site for a long time, and a developer bought it. I had lunch with him. I told him about that project, and I got an email, and he said the kickoff meeting is next week. And so we started working on this project called India Basin. Super cool, 20-something acres of bay fill, and then it's got these wetlands and dunes down at the water's edge. Big kind of feral, funky site, not kind of the last one. It's just stranger than, you can't even make this stuff up. So this guy that lives here, so the bay's out here. The bay used to be all the way back here, and right here, there's this giant house, barn, that used to be a boat barn, and they would build the boats here and launch them right out the back door. A guy that lives there now, he's got a sheep and a bunch of chickens. And San Francisco Magazine wrote a whole story about him. So it's got this kind of wildness and on the edge out there, and it's got the same problem of but there's nothing out there. There's nothing that kind of makes a neighborhood. So this is 4 years of work with a team of architects and kind of urban designers. This will be a new San Francisco neighborhood. Breaks down one of these big industrial blocks into something much more pedestrian and walkable. It's going to have 1,100 units of housing. It'll have shared streets, a big park. All the stormwater will be in a centralized system, so it won't go to the Southeast Treatment Plant. It'll be managed and released to the bay. Big waterfront. It's really got one of everything, and the character of it is very carefully considered, and it's about making a compact urban village in a place where there's really nothing right now. And it's very poignant because we're in a time where housing is really in high demand, and the tendency would just be to kind of make more and not to do it with not to do it very thoughtfully. But this is incredibly thoughtful about the way that it's scaled and sensitive to the neighborhood and retains a lot of the qualities that people like so much about it. And I'm just showing you the images that came out of the process, and I won't talk about them too much. What I think is really interesting is the edge, though, and that's that this is in a place that's changing rapidly, and the bay is going to change. And so a big part of the work that we've been doing is designing this park to be, and repositioning it from a post-industrial thing to having a new set of ecological and social relationships to both the bay and the people that are going to be around it. And so there's things like, there's programming about how people will use it and move through it, and a sculpture program and a big stormwater wetland, and choreographing use and its popularity that it'll inevitably have. And I'm going to tell you guys something too here totally quickly. This is like from a comment set, and so like the next slides you're going to see have like some of our clients' comments kind of pasted on there, but I didn't have time to delete them. Anyway, so it's going to have these incredible moments and encounters with the bay and a really kind of complex landscape. And what's interesting about it is how it's going to change. So here we are now. By 2050, you're going to lose. It's going to sea level rise, and the storm surges are going to reduce the size of that. By 2100, it's going to shrink even more. But what you should notice is that the water system, high and dry, the park, out of it'll still be accessible. The circulation routes, the bike infrastructure. I mean, all these things that are tied to much larger urban systems have been thought out 100 years in advance. And so each of these pieces of the Bay Edge, we're thinking about how it's going to be used now. This is a section of how it's used now, and then we're doing things like building this out of concrete that will be friendly to marine life, and you'll see how over time these things will adapt, and the facilities will still stay useful and in operation, and they'll still serve a lot of their habitat functions. Here, right now the existing topography comes to like this. We're actually carving that down to make a space between the top of the bank and the water. It's kind of like a third space, and then putting seasonal wetlands there. And these seasonal wetlands will start as freshwater, and then as sea level rises, they'll adapt to become salt marsh retreat, and then in places for retreating salt marsh. I'm going to stop there. I just want to say one last thing, which is like, you got a good snapshot of kind of what we're doing, and I told you about the kind of day I'm having. And one of the things, I think about this all the time, is how much I enjoyed being a student, and like I'm totally envious of where where all you are and who's ever watching, wherever they are. That time when you're a student is like so great. I mean, you have this moment where you can like completely focus on your own ideas. It's so really indulgent, and you have this opportunity to be around super smart people and lots of great resources, and you get your head wired right, and then you go out and you do something with it. So like in a sick kind of way, I wish I was sort of like gonna leave from here and go back to my desk and build a model or something like that. So anyway, thanks for
Thank you so much. That was great, and I appreciate that you're still connected to the process of what you learned when you were a student. I think all of you probably wonder where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years, and well, let's open it up to questions. So I don't know if we want to turn the lights on or we want to just keep it the way it is. Whatever you guys want to do is fine.
I have a personal question, but
Yes.
we don't have a question yet from online.
Okay. What's your personal question?
Hi, I'm Catherine. I've been moderating online, and thank you everyone who have joined us. We do have a number of people who have been joining us tonight live, and one of them is in Barbados. So that's a 10-hour flight away, and they are here with us. So that's really wonderful. I personally have a question. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about. I know you talked about some frustrating aspects of leading a project. Dealing with a curb for 3 months. Can you explain sort of like your favorite parts of each project, and then maybe your least favorite, and how you work through the least favorites?
Sure. My favorite part, I would say is one. I rarely have 2 days. I never have 2 days in a row that are the same. That's good. And maybe that's because of the nature of my office, but like I never have 2 days in a row that are the same. My favorite parts are sort of hunting for invention. You know, that all these situations and the projects that we see and the world in front of us is changing super fast, and you can't operate on an old set of assumptions. You look at the new ones, and you look at what's changed, and you can find something, a logic for something different. And so that's kind of exciting. It's like an Easter egg hunt. And then my least favorite is when something good gets a good idea, a good design, a good design opportunity. They're fragile things, right? You conceptualize something, and the world moves like boom, 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 super quick. It's like what you used to get 6 months for, you get 2 months for. A month is now 2 weeks. It's just it's really, things move really quickly, and so, but ideas are still fragile and they need time to cook. And what drives me crazy is when all of the other forces in a project, the contractors and project managers and clients and so on, throw ideas under the bus, or just they get run over in the process of progress. And you've got to be crafty and be really clever and strategic and engaged to keep ideas alive long enough for them to mature, so that everybody else can understand them, so that they can then do them. None of these things happen like just because one person's doing it. It's a kind of a team, and so that's just I don't know. That's kind of a challenge that's kind of in communication, but it also has just a lot to do with your ability to strategize and make something and make something real. Yeah. So I can't tell you how many times I have to argue for like a tree, and it's small and mundane, but it's important, and you got to build a logic about it to say why it should be there, and all the stuff underground that it needs, or this curb that we've been arguing about. I mean, months, but it's important to do. But the same set of skills is the same set of skills that allows you to argue for robbing air conditioners of their water. So it's bigger.
Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you for sharing the project for us. And during your lectures, you mentioned several times of the sediments. So how does sediment that with the sea level rise?
How does sediment relate to sea level rise?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're talking about the sediment and
Yeah.
the sea level rise.
Yeah.
How you work?
Sure. So sediment is like the building block of the bay's ecology, right? It's this fine, silty stuff suspended in water. It's supposed to wash down. It washes down from the Sierra Nevadas and into the bay. And the biggest issue is that it's not coming down from the Sierra Nevadas anymore because of dams and things that trap sediment high up in the watershed. So why that matters is that the salt marshes that are in the bay sit at one elevation right now, and it's the fine sediment that drops on those marshes and allows them to build up when sea level rise builds up. But if there's no sediment, then the marshes will basically drown. So the question is, how do you supply sediment to marshes so they can kind of keep up with the pace of sea level rise? Super complex issue, really interesting. In the competition we're doing right now, Resilient by Design, there's one team, and they're just focused on sediment. their taglines we designed with mud. It's funny. Check it out. Super smart people. Really interesting.
Anybody else? So I have a question. I spent 5 hours with a design studio before you got here, and the project we're working on is that same piece of under the freeway of Highway 101. We're going from Division Street up to about 16th between Vermont and that section. So it was.
We're doing the easy one. That's the hard one.
Right. I know. I gave him the hard one. But one of the things I was curious about, and we're going to have Site Lab, who does the pop-up homeless public space things, come in and talk. But in designing that space, there's this issue about the homeless population, because there's can be like 100 people and tents and everything through that whole neighborhood. How did you address that with the community? Because you can't just assume they're all going to magically disappear, right?
No.
So what did you do? I'm just curious.
We're still doing.
Okay.
I mean, I think the homeless situation that we have here is a failure of government and of a bureaucracy, and that design, you can't out design that. I don't think it's design only can address it. That's one thing. And I think it's exacerbated by our pharmaceutical industry by far. That's just made a bad situation worse. Okay, that said, there are places where if you've got the right, if you've got the competition of use, kids, bikes, cars, commuters, so on, you can kind of oppose those forces against one another, and you can have one set displace another. And you're working in a no man's land. And so you don't have this section you described, no man's land, right? So I don't think the competition is there. Versus on 17th Street, there is competition. That's like that and 16th are the only two ways to get in and out of the freeways, or to get through by the 101. They're little bottlenecks. So the reason I know that is just through analysis and through measuring things and observing things and looking at things. And so I would say, if as you move down the freeway and you're looking at that, what you're looking for is an opposing force to counteract that very complex situation. I don't think you can design your way out of it. I think you can influence and manipulate forces and flows around it, but it's not something that you can design your way out of, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the challenges has been how to develop programming that will activate that space and bring people into it from all these, because it's kind of a hub for a number of neighborhoods. So I just thought it was interesting. I didn't realize you guys were like 3 blocks away, so that was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question though. Tough. That's a tough spot. Spot.
Do I have any other questions? Anybody online? Okay, and we're probably out of time. Okay, so thank you for coming. I'd like to do a quick shout out to Pete Frankel, who works at Bionic and is also a teacher here in our department. So thank you, Pete, for helping us make this connection. And
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Marcel, for coming out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, and for being a great
Appreciate
host.
Oh, and then the possible last speaker who is agreed to come, but I don't have a date, is Mohammed Nuru, who's the Director of Public Works for the City and County of San Francisco, and he's also a landscape architect. And he would like to come and speak. So I'll keep you posted on if we get a date for him when he comes. And if he does not come this fall, we'll get him in the spring, because I think the DPW just hired 50 new landscape architects. There are an incredible number of projects all over San Francisco, and so I think that'll be pretty interesting to hear what they're up to. So again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.